Okay, hi everyone. So you've met me before. I'm Alex. This is Phani.
Hi.
Phani's going to be sort of driving this demo, and I'll sort of be injecting silly comments every now and then. We have, just so I want you to bear with us, we have some serious computer problems at the moment. My computer is where we were planning on running all these demos, and we are remote desktop to cross onto it from Phani's computer at the moment, because Phani's computer is significantly slower.
And 3 years older.
And 3 years older. Mine's got 8 gigs of RAM.
Mine does too.
And so, you know, we don't want to give up on the speed, but we can't use the display. So we're trying to keep this thing going, but there may be some problems. So with that said, I've set your expectations really low. Let's see if we can beat them.
Yeah.
So, Phani, what are we going to do?
So today we're going to look at the EPA's sampling of all the BP oil spill data that they have put up on their public website. And we're going to go through the steps and deploy this as an OData service and show you some scenarios within Excel and Tableau and other reporting tools. So step one, we're going to need to download all the sampling data as a CSV file. And that's what I'm going to do. So we're going to...
Phani, we've already done that, right? Like we've got that on the desktop.
Yes.
Let's just save some time here.
Yes. And we're going to save some bandwidth for you guys.
Yeah.
While you do this.
So on the desktop, in that eScience folder there.
Okay. So
there it is.
What we're planning to do in this demo is, in this talk, is we're going to expose this as an OData service. So one of the first things we'll do is we'll transform some of this data and then put this inside SQL Server. So the first thing I'm going to do is open this up in Excel. And the reason I'm doing this is when the sampling data was collected, it was polluted just the way that the oil was polluted or the water was polluted. And there's a lot of discrepancies in how the data is represented. There's a lot of commas within the data field itself, which means this is a comma-separated file. You can't have commas within the data, which parsers get confused about which part of it is data and which part of it is structure.
And in fact, Excel has evolved over the years into being incredibly tolerant of these kind of things. And so by importing it into Excel, we can do some things to... Excel will line the data up anyway, even though there's commas in certain places. And that's what he's going to do now. And then we can take some of that data and remove the commas and inject underscores. In fact, we've already done this, but
yeah,
do you want to just show what you did, Phani?
So this is what I did. I opened the data up in Excel, and I had the replace button. And we just said, OK, remove all commas and put underscore in them. Now, since Excel is already showing the data, all the data that Excel sees is actually structural data. It doesn't know about the comma separators and other stuff. That's already being shown up there because it figured out what are columns. So if you replace commas here, it's not going to change the underlying structure of the file. It's only going to modify the data that's in the columns.
Yep. And we've already done that once. So if you look at what was the column that had the commas in it?
I think it was the sample name and also the matrix and substance.
Okay.
So it's right now just going through all the columns and then trying to figure out if there's any commas anywhere. A lot of this might look trivial, but we want to make sure that we show you guys about what we went through the first time we did this. And when you guys are working with the same tools to expose your data, what are the kinds of pitfalls you might run into? So there's no commas to replace, so it just said everything's fine. I'm going to save this. Okay. As you can imagine, we've just changed some of the structures of the file to make the data useful. We're not going to change any part of the file itself right now.
So this was what we were talking about up in here. Just up in here, you can see these underscores. Those were commas originally, which of course is going to throw the structure of the CSV file out. And these are the sort of things you have to deal with when you're downloading data from somebody else's, web server or something.
Yeah, you could be a little smarter about this by using something like Montego or other tools which do this transformation for you. But for now, we're going with the brute force approach of just replacing all commas with underscores. So now that the file is in a proper structure, I'm going to close the Excel file down. Save. Did I save?
I think you did.
I did. Just doesn't. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, now we're going to go into SQL Server, and Phani's going to go ahead and create a new database, I think.
Yeah, and what I have right in front of me is the SQL Server Express and SQL Server Management Studio Express. So all of these are free tools. So we already have a database. So this time, from scratch, I'm going to start something with, what do you want to call it?
What do you guys want to call this database? Remember, this is the BP oil spill data, so let's choose something like that, I think. Anything? Any ideas? Any takers? Pollution, maybe? Mess. That's the name of the
Mess.
database.
So do we want to call it BP's mess, or are we all responsible for it?
Yes.
Okay, let's just call it mess. We're all responsible for it. Okay, Excel, you're done. Fine, just close down. Okay, now that... Yes, we are.
Yes, we are all paying for it.
One of the cool things about SQL Server 2008 is it has this ability for importing data in through flat files. So that's what we're going to use to fill up the database with this data.
So the goal here is to take something which was given to us in some kind of form which is not particularly useful for sharing on the web, or it is useful for sharing on the web because someone else did it, but we want to enrich it a little bit better, a little bit more. So we're going to bring it into a database where we can do some shaping. So this is the same sort of stuff that the Montego guys were doing, but this is something you can do today.
Yes. And SQL Server supports a whole lot of import sources. What we're going to pick is we'll pick flat file source, since it's still a CSV. We want to make sure that the step we did in Excel you could do in any other tool. We don't want to bind this just to Excel sources. So we'll say flat file source. It's going to figure out what kind of metadata it needs, and it brings up this view for me. So I can say, okay, go pick up the CSV file that we just cleaned up a little bit. Now, if you remember the data that we had in the Excel or the CSV file, the first row was the timestamp or the stamp about when the data itself was taken. So that row is kind of useless for us from a data import perspective. So we'll just tell it, okay, ignore the first row, and then use the second row as the column names for all the rows that you see. So once I do this, if I go to columns, you can see that it's already figured out what are the kinds of columns that exist and how the data is spread out. And if you guys have any questions during the whole process, feel free to raise your hand, and we don't mind stopping anyway and then going back.
Yeah, in fact, the whole purpose of this kind of thing is to go through some of the problems that you're likely to experience if you do this kind of thing yourself. And in fact, we are going to purposefully cause some errors to occur.
Yes.
And I admit, it's definitely on purpose.
Yes. Yes. And we don't know which ones those are.
Yeah. So just keep your eyes open.
So what I did here is I just changed the destination table to be called samples. You could call it anything you want. And we'll say, okay, next. So at this point, what it's going to do is we just told it how to import the data into the database, what kind of structure should it have, and it's able to figure out the types of the columns based on the data that's present in those columns. And I'm going to hit finish. All right, let's see.
And in fact, we forgot to make the one mistake we really wanted to make on purpose,
Yeah.
which was to leave the file open while attempting to do this, which
Yeah.
would have caused a few errors here. Like we would have got a load of, instead of text, we'd have had some crosses. And so if you run into that problem, it might just be because you have the file open. You can just rerun the import.
Yeah, and all of these dialogues themselves, they don't punish errors too badly. All you can do is you can always go back to the previous step, fix it, and then go back again. At this point, what we have is we have a database inside this mess. We have a table inside this mess database, which is samples. So I can say, I can run a query against this, which is pretty simple. We'll just say, okay, select the first 100 rows from this table.
I don't know if my machine's any quicker today. For some reason, something's going on for sure.
It's probably morally opposed to this data being on it.
Yeah, maybe.
So we just selected the top 100 columns from the table. One of the things that you'll notice is since it's a database table now and we want it to be exposed through different interfaces, it doesn't have something of an identity column. There is no way to specify which column of this table itself to use as a key. So we'll do something which is actually add an identity column to this table, which is, okay, we'll right click on the table and say go to the design view and insert a column called ID.
And this is important because OData itself requires at least one thing that it can use as an identity for its entities. Okay, so there has to be a key. And there may have been things in that table which were unique, but we don't know what they are. So we're going to create another column.
So we'll call this identity column and set this as the primary key.
Yes.
Yes.
Can we create multiple, specify 2 or 3 columns as a key as a unique one?
Yes, you can.
So the question is, can you create more than one column as the key? And absolutely. SQL Server, most databases will support that kind of feature.
And what I have done is after I added that.
Not from database point of view, but from the OData point of view, like.
Oh yes, yes, absolutely.
Yes. From our perspective, the way we look at keys is how we actually formulate queries. As long as the store understands it and the column exists in the database, you should be fine. I wonder if we have time at the end, we can probably show you this about how columns differ across, how keys differ across tables. So by virtue of me adding this column, setting it as the identity, and then adding it to the table definition and saving this in SQL Server Management Studio, what I have now is, so SQL Server automatically added those columns for me. So let me go back down here. So you'll see at the end, there is this thing called ID. And it is automatically incrementing, and it is a primary key that you can use for querying right on top of this. Being database guys ourselves, like this is not enough for us. We want to normalize it somewhere. So, Alex, would you say we actually remove one of these columns and make it a relation?
Yeah, let's do substance.
Substance, okay. So let's run a simple query which tells us how many unique substances exist in this. So the database contains about 78,000 rows. Okay, I should have done count.
We've got 246 substances.
Yep, and those are only spread and those are repeated across 79,000 rows. So you don't want this to be filling up your database. You might want to flatten it a little bit. So what we'll do is we'll for demonstrating relationships in OData, what we'll do is in the store we'll create another table called substance type, which takes all the distinct substance property values from the samples table and puts it into a different table.
So we're going to use the substance type as the key in another table, and then we're going to kind of build a relationship between the two. Okay? And this illustrates an interesting thing that you could do, of course, at this point. If you know more information about those substances, like, I don't know, for example, their chemical formula or something like that, you could inject that extra data into this other table, and you wouldn't be having to repeat it through your data.
Okay. So I ran this simple SQL command which says, okay, select distinct values from substance and then put it into a different table. The into command or syntax actually creates another new table and then creates a structure as the results come in. So what you see here, we created a table called samples through data import. Now I can select this and then say, okay, refresh all the tables. So now the database went ahead and created this thing called substance type for me. Now once we have all of these, let's say we set up a relationship. And I'll do this by doing something called a new database diagram, which is the designer for setting up relationships between two different database objects, in this case tables.
Now this is going to look a little bit weird at this stage because all we've done is created another table with the same data in it. But if we'd added extra columns and had more information about the substances, then this would be perfectly, a very useful thing to do. And in fact, once we've built the relationships, we'll add a couple of extra columns and just fill in a little bit of data, not much, just enough to know that there's actually some there.
Okay. So do you want
to use Silvex, right?
Yes, we should be.
Yeah. So we're big fans of Silvex. Because we don't know what it is, but it sounds better than silver.
It sounds cool. It sounds like silver with X factor on it. So what we have here is I've just created the substance. So substance type table has substance as a primary key column. You can add more data to it, which probably has metadata about the substance itself, like let's say chemical symbols, for instance. And since it's been about 15 years since I did chemistry, I don't remember any of those. So the way we create a relationship is pretty simple. You just pick the column that you want to map. So substance from samples table maps to substance from substance type.
As number would be another one.
Oh, yes, there are clearly lots that you could do in here.
Yeah.
In fact, there was some that we did earlier, but in this particular example, we're not doing it on purpose so that we can build it later in Power Pivot.
So again, as part of the designer interface, by virtue of just saving this diagram itself, we've created the database structure underlying. So we're done from the database perspective. So now what we'll do is we'll move one level above.
Let's go back into that database and just add that extra column in the substance type table.
Okay, let's call it description. How does that sound?
And let's put something in for Silvex, like this is cool or something. Just for one of the rows. I mean, you can imagine that we're going to do more.
Okay, let's save this, and let's pick up the first 200 rows. Let's hope it's in the first 200. Just to select, I guess. So as I move into different environments, SQL Server, Visual Studio, and browser and Excel, I'm acting as different roles. So it's not necessary that all the roles be performed by the same person. But as I move, I do context switches. And we want to make sure that you guys understand that there are some context switches involved. And it's not necessary that just one person goes through these. You can have different people in different roles doing this. Let's see if we can find Silvex. A lot of these are just numbers.
So it's going to be near the bottom, unfortunately.
In
In fact, it's not even in the top 200, so let's get the next lot. Can you use that little arrow to go to the next page?
Yeah, let's see if we can do this.
No, you can't.
Oh.
No. Okay.
Yeah, let's see if we can edit.
And isn't there an open table thing, or was that gone there?
Oh, that's in Visual Studio. Let's just do an update then.
Okay.
We wanted to do this visually, but since it seems as if the gods are against us.
And now I know why you didn't want to do this, Phani, and so like I apologize for putting you on the spot.
Okay. What do you want to set it to?
We're going to set the description to this is cooler than silver. It's probably really bad. You guys know. I have no idea. What is Silvex? Anybody know what Silvex is?
What are we talking about? Chemistry.
Okay. Now I know I didn't want to do this.
Where, let's make sure we have our where clause in there.
Substance.
I think we need a table somewhere too, don't we?
What is it missing? Actually, let's just do
Has like chemistry. Yeah.
What is Silvex? You don't know what Silvex? Oh, come on. We thought this audience would completely nail this and know exactly what it is.
Okay, I found something on Wikipedia.
Yeah.
What is it?
I found something on Wikipedia.
Oh, okay. What is Silvex?
It's
It's dodgy?
2, 2, 4, 5, 3 chloro.
Oh, that makes so much more sense.
Is there anything humans can understand?
The name Silvex is used in the US.
It's harmful if swallowed.
Okay, I think we're going with silver with X factor.
Yes. Okay, silver with X factor. Sounds good. For the people in the audience who don't know why it's got X factor, that's because Phani is a big comic book fan. Okay, so it's all about X-Men.
Who isn't? Okay, finally.
Woohoo! We've updated the data.
Yes. I sure hope my boss doesn't see this. Can we order this?
Well, you do a where clause.
Yeah, I guess it is. Yeah, okay.
Way. Okay, anyway, clearly that's not what we advise you to do.
Yeah.
It's just that we're going to use that later in the demo to prove that we can do a navigation and find that.
Okay.
Okay.
So I'm going to do a context switch now from being a database developer to be a Visual Studio developer.
And so what we're doing here really is we're going from, hey, we got the data somewhere where we can query it. Now we're going to create a model through which we're going to expose that data. Okay? So we're opening up Visual Studio.
And this is the ultimate version, ultimate edition of Visual Studio. You could always use the Developer Express edition, which has almost all the same features that are required from a data developer perspective. But we don't want to discourage you from spending more money on these products. So if you want to buy it, we've got, as you can see, we've done this once before, which is the BP oil spill data. I'm going to create a new project called Mess Service.
Yeah, that sounds like a good name.
3 S's in it. Yeah.
Yes, it's always good to have 3 S's in a row.
Yep. So I'm going to create I'm switching right now into ASP.NET. How many people here know what ASP.NET is or have worked with it?
Okay.
That's a sizable chunk.
So ASP.NET is a framework that allows you to create websites using the .NET framework. Okay, so you're programming generally in .NET, and there's a kind of set of framework pieces that allow you to make that easy. There's actually a lot of flavors of ASP.NET, going from kind of the older Windows web forms style all the way through to the MVC, which is kind of more modern. We're up to MVC 3 now, and there's a thing in there called Razor, which is a new view engine and so forth. So you know, there's a lot of choices when you're in the ASP.NET.
Okay. So now that I've got the service set up, I'm going to add a new artifact to this project, this website called an entity data model. One of the things that the team I work on builds in general is the entity framework, and the entity data model is an artifact of the same. Alex, do you know anything about this?
Yeah, I do actually know a little bit about entity framework and in particular the entity data model. I used to be the program manager for the entity data model before I became the program manager for OData. So what the entity framework and entity data model in particular give you is the ability to kind of take a model in a database, which is, that's kind of think of that as the logical model in the database, the structure, the tables, the columns, that kind of thing, and do a mapping of that into a conceptual model, which is essentially the thing you want people to interact with. Okay, so there can be some sort of mapping going on between those two pieces to get rid of any kind of, maybe the names in the database don't make sense for consumers, the column names, that kind of thing. The table names might not be right. Someone might have produced, Hungarian notation column names, and you don't want to expose that through a web service. So that's what the entity framework and EDM give you. So we're going to go ahead and generate an EDM from the database.
Yep. And we'll connect to the MES database that we just created a few minutes ago. So this is a standard SQL Server connection dialog. I'll just say connect to SQL Express. And the database I want to connect to is called MES. Okay, connection succeeded. What is that? I think that's Alex's machine.
It's playing up again. It's fun.
At this point, what the entity data model is going to do is it's going to connect to the database and then pull in metadata about SQL Server. If you guys are familiar with, what is it called, SQM? There is a metadata model that SQL Server provides, and the tools are using the same thing to pull in information about which tables are inside the database and what kind of relationships they have, what columns are on each of the tables.
Yeah, if you're interested in this stuff, inside a SQL Server database, there's a series of databases or tables that start with sys. So there's sys tables, sys cols, and all that kind of stuff. And essentially, the entity framework is asking the database questions against those. It's writing queries against think of that as the meta model of the database. And from that, it can infer the shape of entities and so forth. So that's what it's doing at the moment. It's going off to the database. And if we look inside the tables there, it's kind of pulled back the tables that it's found in there.
Okay. And we're going to use samples and substance type because those are the two things we care about. Sys diagrams is just a system table. Think of it as a system file. You don't want to mess with it. Just leave it at it.
That's actually how the database draws diagrams. If you create diagrams and add them to your database, they get kind of put in sys diagrams. The sys is a good hint that you should leave it alone, though.
Yes. And don't name any of your tables sys.
Yes, that's. I'm not sure that my machine is any faster than your machine, Phani.
That's because I'm remoted into your machine.
But no, this is not screen redrawing that's taking time. This is my machine that's taking time.
I don't know. I think we've shaved off about 20 minutes of the demo by just not using the machine.
Yep. Okay.
Let's do that. At this point, what it's doing is, so there's a metadata system that SQL Server uses for describing diagrams and stuff. And what you're seeing right now is Entity Framework trying to redraw the same diagram using its metadata system. Well, it's not just a metadata system, but a mapping system. So once this comes up, you'll be able to see what I'm talking about.
Wow.
I wonder if it's because of the remote desktop.
No. Yeah. Anyway, so here's the model that was inferred from the database, and you can see it's essentially one-to-one. Okay, it knows about the relationship between the tables. It's introduced these navigation properties between. So this from a substance. Okay, right. From a substance type, I can navigate to the samples that correspond, and from a sample, I can navigate back to the substance type associated with that sample. Okay, so those are two navigation properties, and kind of like it's all in one direction there's many, and in the other direction there's one.
Okay, and when I talked about mapping models. If you guys have been on the internet long enough, you do know that if somebody's typing in all uppercase or all capitals, that person is mostly yelling at you. And we don't want to make it sound as if when we push this in a data service that we're yelling at everyone consuming the data service. So Alex, do you think we can change any of these column names?
Oh, absolutely. We could, for example, use camel case.
Okay.
It would be pretty extreme, but we could do it.
Okay, let's try this with sample name then.
Wow.
I don't think it wants me to do that.
No, do it. You click on that thing. I think it'll work. I had the same problem earlier. There you go.
I think that looks a lot more civilized.
Yes, and really you should do that for all of your data. Choose the right name for the consumer, because this is what we're doing now is we're creating the model that we want the rest of the world to see. So it might be quite different from what you originally had in your database.
Okay.
Yep.
Just to add, I think there's some add-ins that can allow you to for entity data model to put it in different name conventions.
Sure. So so it's not a question; it's a statement. It's a statement. There are some add-ins that allow you to do that. I think the person is Hugani or something.
It's a paid.
Yeah. So he's actually I think he's an MVP, and he's an MVP in the data space. So his stuff is good. So I think it's Hugani Tools or something, something like that.
Yeah, they are pretty good. I think the reason we're doing this is to show the demonstration, is to demonstrate that this is all mapping model level. The change that I made to the field name has not propagated back to the database.
No.
And why is that, Alex?
Well, it's because this is a conceptual model and the database is the logical model, and we just want to keep them separate.
Okay. So once we're done, so now I've switched over from being a SQL database developer to be a Visual Studio data developer. I'm going to go ahead and set up a data service right on top of this. Now, you guys have been hearing about OData for most of this talk and the talks before this. So I'll show you how easy it is to set up one right on top of your EDM model. I go to project, right click, and then say add new item. And over here, I'm going to go ahead and say, okay, give me a data service. The search is pretty cool. There's a whole lot of items here. And I'm going to call this mass data service. So what this is it's an item template which allows you to expose your existing data model as an OData service. And what you see when you come up, the first thing that it does is it gives you a comment that says, okay, put your data column here.
Or data source.
So
this is where we're going to put the name of the class that Entity Framework generated for us for our connection to the database.
Okay,
so this is the thing that there it is, mess entities. And that's the thing that we think of. If you are familiar with database programming in terms of data tables and data rows and that kind of, and data connections, think of this as the thing which encapsulates our connection to the database. But it's strongly typed. So it's kind of, it knows about the shape of the database and has classes and things that match those shapes, rather than dealing with rows where you have to access things with strings for column names and so forth.
And the first thing I did once I set the data source was, if you notice, I changed this line called set entity set access rule. What this does is it tells the WCF data services server-side runtime that this is the access rule that I want you to use for each set in the store. Star is just a wildcard that you do only for demos. You don't use it for actual production code. You could put the name of the set in there, for example, samples or substance types, and it'll apply the policy for each request to that set, whether it be directly or through some other way. The entity set writes is actually a good example of how we do policies on the server side. So it's got all, which is update and read and delete. So you got a whole lot of these: write append, write delete. So you can have a write-only service. You can have a read-only service just by deploying a different kind of a different WCF data service on top of the same EDM model.
Notice you're making absolutely no changes to your database at this point, right? This is you are changing how you interact with the database through the web.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is, as part of this is just Visual Studio magic. I'm going to go ahead and set this page as a startup page, and then hit run.
And it will take a little while, but it's based on past experience.
Yeah, because it's IE9. Okay. Did it break?
I think it's coming. Let's give it some time. I think it's not because it's IE9 so much. It's because we're using the embedded Visual Studio web server. And
while the web server is good for development of websites and stuff, it's not really great for data services. So we suggest that you use the server built into your Windows machines.
Yeah. It's easy enough to change through the settings inside Visual Studio. You can change which web server is used to render or to present your service.
Okay. So what we have here is an OData service, and this looks no different from the other services you've been seeing all day. And that's one of the parts that it brings up. So I'm going to run a couple of queries that are just very, very simple. And I'll show you how the Uri syntax looks. You've seen this already. I'll just run the same over on top of these data sources to show you how the queries themselves are driven by metadata, and they're not dependent on the underlying store, be it SQL Server, Excel, an XML file, anything. Let's go with the same. What is the type again? Oh, Silvex. So what I'm going to do is, let's just bring all the substance types back.
Yep, let's do that. But let's not bring back all the samples because we know there's quite a lot of those.
Yes.
So before we do that, we'll add server-driven paging to our OData service.
And if I've set up everything right, it should.
Yeah. This is where we have our fingers crossed.
Yeah, the reason we do that is because it's a whole lot of XML, and IE tries to be smart about it and render it as something that it understands. So it parses the XML instead of just being dumb about it and then show it to you. Firefox and Chrome do this automatically. They don't try to render the XML into some other format.
Okay.
I wonder if it's broken.
Give it a chance. I think it's just slow.
So at this point, what it's doing is, if you see the query up there, it says substance types. It goes to the EF with if you guys are familiar with expressions and formulas, it formulates an expression which says, from the data source, give me substance types. So that's all it knows about. From the data source, give me substance types. Now it gives it to the underlying provider. Now the underlying provider is able to convert that formula into the store-specific query. From the data source, give me substance types for EF means go to the database and run select star from substance types, or select column names from substance types.
That's awesomely fast.
It is. I'm going to shut this down and run it again.
Okay.
So let's just do top 100, I guess.
Now I want to highlight that this is exactly the problems we were communicating at the start of the session. So we've set your expectations, and this is exactly what we were expecting. This machine has got problems. I do not know what exactly, but it's definitely got problems.
Be okay if I
Sorry,
ask
that was a question. Yeah, that's a great way to use some of this time.
So you've basically brought up a data service resource into Visual Studio, and I've seen nothing mentioned about OData. There's nothing branded about it. It's like we make the assumption that a WCF data service, that you instantiate is OData.
That's
compliant.
right. So,
okay.
The OData name kind of has a kind of a history. It comes out of WCF data services. Then we realized that was something which was more broadly applicable than what we just had. So we had this with this set of capabilities, and we said, okay, this looks like a really useful protocol in lots of places, and in fact it has been. People are using it all over the place. But the names kind of stick for what people are used to programming in .NET and creating WCF data services.
The way I look at it is there's a standard and there's an implementation of the standard.
Yeah.
It's just weird that the implementation of the standard came first and then the standard came out of it. Okay. But I don't think that's counterintuitive. It's actually really good that we were able to take our design principle while building the product was so good that we were able to just apply them to something else without the need for .NET or anything else.
You might not even realize you're using OData.
We didn't at the time, no.
We didn't know we were building OData back then, and then we said.
No, I get your point though. So what you're saying is like maybe in the next version of of WCF data services, we should give it a different name, like call it an OData service or something.
At least to the developer, make it clear
Yeah.
that if they want to implement OData,
Yeah.
it's basically you're looking at the WCF data service.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so
That's
the
a good
query's
question.
run.
Yeah, it's run, and I think I've got back all the substance stuff, the first 100 ones at least. You want to make it so that people don't have to remember that they have to put a top 100?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. So we talked about, I think
I'll cover this. You start doing the setup. So remember when I did the talk earlier, we talked about server-driven paging and how it would be very easy for someone to ask either a naive or a malicious question of a data service that asks for all of the data. And if there's lots of data, that would be a very resource-intensive query. So, and we know that we don't actually have that many substances, So maybe 246 substances is not the end of the world, but we do have a lot of samples. We've got 76,000 or something. So what Phani's just done is put in a page size limit. And what that means is the server will never give more than 100 results in one query for one request.
Okay.
In fact, it's probably better if you chose a smaller number. Sorry to,
Okay.
just so that we can see the paging in action. So you don't do this in practice because usually 100 is a good size, but something like 5 or so gives us a really good idea of what's going on.
Okay. As I mentioned earlier, the star is actually a wildcard again, and you do this only for demos, not for your actual production code. The first parameter it takes is the set name as you would specify in the entity set access role. So if you have restricted visibility through saying that this set is not visible to anyone, you will not be able to page it or any of that stuff. So I just set the page size to 5, and from the service description, you will not be able to actually tell whether some set is paged or not. So for a user, for a generic client, this looks the same as it would if the page was not even paged, if the set was not paged in the first place. So I say substance types, and how many entities do I get back? So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Alex, what is this next line?
So that's, sometimes even though the server is enforcing paging on your behalf, automatically, you do actually want to get all of the data. So the way you do that is you start consuming this thing here, which is we call a next link, right? And that's where you get the next page of data from.
Okay.
So if you issue a query, and let's say you want to get every sample for a particular location, and there happens to be 4,000 for that particular location, then you'll get your first page of 100. And what you do is you actually just keep iterating and grabbing the data by following all the next links until there are no more next links. Because when you get to the the 40th page or the 400th page or whatever, 40th page, the last page won't have a next link because there is no more data that matches your query.
Yeah. I think a way to enforce that is, if you guys remember, we have about 260 something rows in the database.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say skip the first 255 rows and take the next 5.
The 256? I think it was 246.
46.
Yeah.
Okay, 245. The last page has no next link. You're done. You have a question there?
Yeah, sorry.
Take your time.
Do you have a roadmap for also including, you just did a sample with numbers and text, but there's also those 2 data types, geospatial, geometry, and geography.
Yes.
That's not supported in EF, and then through WCF Data Services, aka OData. Is there a roadmap to eventually support that?
Yeah,
those data types?
So we are definitely evaluating exactly how much of that we have to support. What's the kind of the sweet spot? Because as I think I mentioned this in the earlier talk, there's this kind of there's this tension between keeping the protocol simple and adding features. And we think clearly spatial data is valuable to the ecosystem. It adds, everybody's using it, not least of which for things like maps and so forth. But we don't know that we want to burden every server with having to support spatial either. So we've got to figure out how we add the feature in such a way that it's not unduly taxing on the ecosystem as a whole. And I think we clearly think that this is an important feature. So don't take this as saying, hey, no, we don't think we should do that, because I do think we do. We're just trying to work out where the line is in terms of how far you go. And that's where we said, go and vote for it as well. I know the EF guys are working on spatial, and we are as well.
Okay. And at this point, I'm going to make a context switch to be an Excel IW.
Yes. So just to summarize where we're up to then, while Phani gets everything going because of this machine speed, what we did is we took some data from some other source, we brought it into our database, we massaged it a little bit, potentially we added some extra data that we have collected from somewhere else into that database as well. We then created an entity framework model, and we didn't really do much with that entity framework model, although we could have started writing programs that interact with that database just using the entity framework. So we could have written like a website to add more data to it. We could have written an application which looks at some trends in the database and projects out into and creates some more data into the future or something like that. Those are the sorts of things we could have done with the entity framework. And then we moved another level and said, well, we've got all this data, we've got this model, we can interact with it, we're going to expose it to the web so that people can interact with it through web services. And now we're going to show you, so now we actually have a real client who wants to interact with that data.
Alex, where's Parpivot? You installed it on this machine? Or is it on the machine?
I think you installed it on this machine.
Yeah, I don't find it. Oh, this is embarrassing.
We installed I assure you, we installed PowerPivot on this machine this morning.
I wonder if we just canceled all plugins and stuff.
Sorry?
Oh, that explains.
Yes. Oh no, come on, that's a bit harsh. I am not going to throw PowerShell under the bus, PowerPivot under the bus like that. There's a number of things I installed on here today, one of which was an NVIDIA video driver. Now that may have been a big mistake.
Probably.
Okay, I think the plugin's gone.
Okay.
So let's do this. Let's see if we can get Tableau up. And you guys are going to see a PowerPivot demo right after this. So you will get to see OData, or we'll see if we can bribe them to show some OData.
Yeah.
I'm going to use this thing called Tableau Public, which is a free tool that everyone can get access to. Just go to tableaupublic.com and you'll be able to download this data visualization tool, which understands OData.
It's actually very, very flash. You're going to see in a minute it can do some pretty nifty graphs.
I think the tagline was, you're limited by your imagination. And let's see how this goes. Hopefully this will work. Okay, all we need to remember at this point...
hey, why don't you... Phani, I just had an idea. Could you connect to my service from your machine?
Yes, we can. Let's just publish it in a place where we can see this. So
okay.
Right now it's running on localhost, which means this is running on a local server, which doesn't accept connection from outside. So I'm going to see if I can use my IIS magic to set this up real quickly.
Okay. So I mean, what we're doing is we're exposing data to the web. So hopefully, although we were just testing at this point and just exposing it to our machine through our local web server, clearly we should be able to expose it to the rest of the web as well. So that's what we're going to use here, because like Phani's machine actually does have PowerPivot on it.
And I'm sure about that.
Yes. I'm sure you installed PowerPivot on my machine this morning as well.
Okay, let's call it mass OData. Okay, that's not what I want. Okay.
You need to change the application pool or anything like that?
I think it's running under the default app pool, which is already set up to run.
I'm not sure.
Check. Let's find out.
Check its app. I put it under. Change it to go under my application. I've got an application pool there, which is running under my credentials, which I know will.
Oh, okay.
Which I know will have access to the database.
Okay, so let's set that down. Is this it?
Yes, that's the one. You want that guy. There are some things when you're setting up websites and you have connections to databases and you're using, there's a form of connections to the actual database, the connection string, which is based on the current user's credentials. And that's what we call integrated security. So if we just set this up as a website and that website was running under, excuse me, was running under a particular set of credentials, and that set of credentials doesn't have access to the database, then it wouldn't be able to connect. Even though we've configured the entity framework and so forth, we've said, hey, use the credentials of the currently running thing. So what I was just getting Phani to do was to use a set of credentials, use an application pool, which is set up to run under a set of credentials I know has access to the database. And so the site would be, would have access to things. When it tries to open connections to the database, it will be able to get to the database. So these are, in fact, if you ever do this kind of stuff, this is one of those areas where you're likely to, run into some issues. So remember this conversation.
Yeah, and as you can see, it's actually struggling to connect to Alex's machine, and that's because his firewall is preventing connections, outbound connections or inbound connections from port 80, and that's the port that web services or www.http uses. And okay.
Just turn off the firewall for a while. Can we do that?
I don't know if we can. Networks, IT doesn't allow us to do that. I think we can set it up so that it allows one port to go out.
Okay. So now, if you're putting this on a real web server that's going out onto the web, you usually don't have these problems. Usually port 80 is allowed explicitly.
Yes. That went on. Okay, no, it's because I brought up the firewall. Great.
Any questions while we're trying to troubleshoot? Any questions? Is there anything you want us to do while we're trying to troubleshoot? Is there anything
Would
you
you
want us to explain?
rather propose a different scenario for them to
Yeah,
show?
we're totally open to
Anything that you could, associate your scenarios with open data article.
What about this guy? Yeah, that's the one, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it.
We go try it now. Okay. Maybe this was a bad idea.
Actually, let's do this later, but I think we can at least get this in Tableau.
Okay, let's do that. Again, another bad idea from me. Phani had the right idea to start off with.
It's fine. Okay, so we're in this tool called Tableau, which allows us to connect to arbitrary data sources. It's not a Microsoft tool. They use some of our technologies to be able to parse any given OData feed. And as you can see, when it says connect to data, it's got a couple of options: Access, Excel, OData, text file, or Windows Azure Marketplace. So I'm going to say, okay, I want OData, and I want to connect to samples. So what it does, I think this tool actually does a lot of this stuff in memory, but you can imagine that tools are written which do this on the fly. So that's what you see right now. When it says rows retrieved, it's using the server-driven paging token to actually go get the next rows. And it knows that how many rows exist, and that's one of the reasons why you see X of Y column table.
And that was what we talked about earlier. It would have, when it issued the query, it would have issued an inline either a count request or an inline count request. So I don't think we should try and import 78,000.
Okay,
so let's change can we change the query?
Yeah, let's change the query. I'm going to say
this
first,
is an example of what the application is. It really does want all of the data, so it's going to go and seamlessly kind of consume those next links to get all of the data. But let's say we're just interested in
10,000.
10,000. Well, that's going to take a while too, but.
Actually, that's about the smallest range I can find, which is useful.
Okay.
So while this downloads, what you do see, I think we've made context switches throughout the demo or throughout the talk. We started as somebody who was working with CSV files or Excel, and then we moved to SQL Server, where we made certain kinds of relationships between the data that didn't exist, but because we were able to look at it and we know something about how data structure should look like, that we were able to create the relationship between them. And we added a new column to the table. So we annotated existing data in the database and then pulled it into an EDM data model, which is a conceptual model. We made changes to the model, but those are not reflected back to the data service. And we came to the database. Sorry. Then we came to the data service layer, where we're exposing that same database as an EDM model through the data service interface. Now, once we got there, we added additional policy right on top of the changed model, which said you can only read, and for each request you only get about 100 rows. As you can see, you are making a couple of context switches as you go through those. A lot of these are natural. If you find that some of these are unnatural, then we'd love to hear about it.
Yeah.
Oh, that didn't take long.
So that was your 10,000 row spiel.
I was trying to.
It was a good try.
Yes.
How many now? 3,500 to go. So any questions while we've got 3,500 rows? Yes?
Well, I know the questions come up about...
Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate it.
So I know the question has come up about geographic extents being able to select by lat long. Something theoretically may get put into the OData spec. Does the OData specification in general allow you to perform resource queries on extents of any sort, whether it's time or a range of values, anything like that?
So long as the thing that you want to query on is part of your model somehow. So, for example, if you, in fact, this sample data has time as part of, is one of the, the date that the sample was taken. So you could clearly ask for example, all of the samples taken on Tuesday. Or you could ask for all of the samples taken at a particular location over a range of dates, and you get back, so then you could do a time series kind of graph. And that's kind of, I think, what we're going to try and do here.
I think you can simulate ranges by greater than and lesser than queries. And all kinds of data types are supported in the URI space. Dates, GUIDs, Booleans, pick your types. If they can be represented in CLR, then we can query them.
There's also pretty prevalent in atmospherics and meteorology. They have gridded data that's three-dimensional, and they have a pretty well-defined data format for that.
Okay.
They have certain protocols that allow you to subset out of that grid.
Okay.
Do you envision something like that for OData?
So one of the things I didn't talk about in the, when we were looking into the future for OData, we didn't really talk about functions. But we have this idea, and in fact, I'm working on it right now, to figure out how you might be able to add functions to your model, which essentially from the OData perspective are opaque. And then you can model things like transformations and things that OData knows nothing about as functions that you can then call inside the OData URLs and so forth. So yeah, absolutely.
And as you can see, we gave up on 10,000 rows. Let's go with 1,000 rows.
It didn't work?
Well, it downloaded, and it's taking forever to analyze the data.
Oh. Okay.
As you can see, one of the prevalent links in this tool is upgrade to professional, and I think it's a good way of getting people to do that. Just show a loading box for like 2 minutes and then.
Yes, that'll get you going.
Yeah. Hopefully, by the end of this talk, we'll be able to bring up at least one report and switch over to the IW hat. While we're doing this, I think we're coming to the end of the demo itself. So let's give this one more minute, and then we can start taking questions. Or if you guys have any requests, we'd be glad to take them.
Is there anything in particular that you want to have help about thinking about how you might model it? Like you have a particular problem, and you're wondering, okay, how would I project that into OData? What might I do? How might I model that? Does anybody have that kind of question? Like for example, I've seen a lot of examples where you have kind of column-oriented data instead of so the time is kind of columnar, and you really need to kind of transform it to be row-oriented for you to do a query against it. So those are the sorts of things that I think you could clearly do with an OData custom data provider. But that's the kind of thing I'm wondering, has anybody got questions like that?
Here we go.
Coming to the format of transposing, we do a lot with pivot and unpivot and the SQL Server point of view.
Yes.
When we create a view with a specific query so that we can transpose the data itself so that it will be more informational or stored more naturally than what's supposed to be as a report oriented.
Yeah.
So you're saying that the same functionality is available in OData, is it right?
Okay, so OData today does not have kind of hot first-class aggregate support. So you can't do transformations, group bys, those kinds of things in the OData protocol itself. But this kind of goes to the question around where is the appropriate place to do the transformation. We've got these various layers, and the question is, do you want the person asking the question of your web service to be asked to be doing the group bys and that kind of thing, or do you want the service that you expose, the conceptual model that you expose, to already have done that for them? To go, okay, here's a very common pattern. people are going to want to, for example, are going to want to see movies grouped by genre, right? So if that's the case, then I will produce a model that does that for them, and I'll produce statistics around that already for them. I'll do pre-summing and all that kind of stuff. And so essentially what you're doing is you're creating a view over the top of some pre-calculated measures, right? So OData today doesn't have first-class support for asking arbitrary, cube-like questions at the surface, but clearly you can expose, the kind of views that you want to over the top of your cubes.
And is there any limitation on the number of columns that you can have in a table that would not support an OData?
So in theory, no. In practice, of course. I'm not sure what the limit is. I would guess that if you're starting to get above 200 columns, things are starting to get a bit awkward, mainly because of the kind of the width, the amount of data that's being traveling around with your row. I would suggest that hopefully there's opportunities to kind of normalize that data a little bit. Hopefully. There may not be, but hopefully.
So the protocol itself does not limit that.
Sorry?
The protocol itself does not limit that.
No, the protocol doesn't, but I think there are practical limitations when you're dealing with something has to implement the protocol. And it's going to have to deal with, very wide data. And you might be able to find something that can deal with that efficiently, but I'm not aware of one.
And
that would be true with any protocol.
with any Windows operating system, I just want to get back to that one point, and then we'll take your question. With any Windows OS, you got about 2 GB of user space. I mean, if you have a table which is gigantically wide, short, you do run into some kind of limits which are really not going to be helpful for you. You can project into it and then say that, look, I know that the metadata for this thing describes the table as having 500 columns. I want 4 columns. You can do that.
Because I see we have a scenario wherein a particular column which is a text base, 8,000 characters. Even if you just have that particular column and try to query on that, it's going to just limit from the SQL point of view. So you can't do that. Means we've been trying that and then it just hangs at a certain point. So if you have certain scenarios, like if you're trying to expose that in OData, and you shouldn't be providing that flexibility. Of course, OData doesn't have support for text, I guess, right now, right? Or does it?
So no, OData does have support for text, and we'll be able to expose that, but it will just push a query down to the underlying provider. So if that doesn't support querying that text, then you'll essentially get an error message coming up through the stack.
It does support, but it is very slow. That's what I mean to say.
So when you do it's not OData that's slow. Okay. It's the implementation under the hood, right? It's like clearly you can ask a question through the protocol.
Okay.
The question is how are the implementations work? So I would separate OData from WCF data services and in this case SQL Server, because maybe those guys today don't handle those types of queries very well. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean the protocol doesn't. The protocol is capable of asking the question very effectively. The question is, how well do you implement the answer to the question?
Another question I have is, does it support full text searching from OData?
Nope. Not today. Although this is the sort of thing that we think something like actions will support.
And if you want questions about actions, you can just find us later.
Yep.
We're here tomorrow.
Yep.
Too. I think we have another question though.
Yep.
Yeah,
Did
you
you?
have 5 minutes.
Yep.
I wonder, can we customize our own operators in the filter? Like you have a greater than, less than?
So you mean, so we're talking about, you want to add new capabilities inside filter, or do you want to add something as well as filter?
As well as filter.
As well as filter. So your own kind of
both.
Query option, or both.
Yeah.
So I think the things that live inside filters, you can think of that as being a function.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, you will be able to. It's not, operators are just kind of intrinsic functions, right?
Yeah.
So, so we won't be able to add your own intrinsic functions to the protocol, but you will be able to add your own functions.
Okay.
So that will help you there. In terms of things that you do outside of filter in your own kind of query string parameters, you're free to do it. The challenge is if you do that, is the ecosystem going to know that you've done it?
You heard discoverability.
You've just kind of you are doing something which is not part of the standard anymore.
And
Does
it's
that make
not
sense?
as if no one's done this before. eBay's done this. Like eBay does their whole catalog search, which is open, which is text-based search, and you do that, and they do that in their backend through custom query options.
So it can be done.
Can be done.
The question, you have to be conscious of the fact that you're opting out of very broad support for your thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I also wonder if that can be done. Can we add that description in the metadata? So what?
Yeah.
kind of-
So this is. I think you're coming to the kind of the vocabularies discussion again. Back to, we are thinking about how you might add things to both the metadata and to the data. So like, there are annotations that apply kind of at the type level, and there are annotations that apply at the instance level. And so we're thinking about both of those. And I think this is the kind of thing where, it's clearly an annotation that you could inject, but you would treat it as kind of a more first-class annotation, which we would call a vocabulary. And you would hope that you publish information about that vocabulary, and you would hope that if there are other people who understand your vocabulary, they will be able to leverage it as well. So in fact, that's the kind of the definition of vocabulary, our working definition of a vocabulary. It's something where there is shared understanding of something which extends the protocol.
Another question, and is it possible to introduce new types or using custom types? For example, if I create my own type instead of integer 32 or Boolean, just to publish my own type and just be as part of the framework, or just simple types?
So today we are investigating how that might work in the future, but as of right now, the answer is no. You have a set of primitive types from which you build up other types.
Because I was more interested like in SQL geography and SQL geometry for types.
No, I think that goes to the different question about spatial.
We would go to custom type. So as long as a custom type, it doesn't matter which one.
No. So if the question is about spatial types, then I think that's likely to come.
Okay.
If the question is about custom UDTs, that's a slightly different question. And I think that we're not so sure about that one.
Okay.
And also, you can probably expose the type, but the semantics about the type won't be inferred by us. Like, let's say you expose geographical data and then you flatten it out and then put it in a different format. Okay. We won't be able to layer semantics right on top of it. I think we're done with.
I think we're wrapping up. I've been given the 2 minutes warning, so so everybody, if there's any other questions, just come up and see us afterwards, please.
Right, please do. And so this is actually the first time I think OData running into a whole group of scientists and given enough amount of time really, discuss and they can hear you now. So take the opportunity. I mean, if so many people all go to the forum saying, we really do need a spatial support.
Voices count. You have no idea.
That's how they decide the priorities. So you want to contribute to that decision.
Yep.
So thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much.